Some victories are won with blood, and some just walk through the front door and hand themselves over. It is the afternoon of the 23rd of June, 1942, a small Royal Air Force base called Pembrey, tucked away on the coast of South Wales. A quiet place, a training field, the kind of airfield where nothing ever happens. And then the men on the ground hear it. An engine, a single fighter, coming in low out of the haze. But it's coming from the wrong direction. It's coming in from the sea, from the south, as if it has just crossed the Channel from France. And there are no British fighters due back from that heading. Not now, not here. The men shade their eyes and squint up at it, and their stomachs drop. Because that shape is wrong. That's not a Spitfire. That's not a Hurricane. That blunt nose, those broad clipped wings, that snarl in the engine note, that is a German fighter. The newest, deadliest machine in the whole of the Luftwaffe. The plane that had been butchering the RAF for the better part of a year. For a heartbeat, the men on the ground simply can't make it fit. What is that doing here? This far inside Britain, alone, no escort, no bombs slung underneath, no British fighters chasing it in? It makes no sense at all. A lone Focke-Wulf 190 does not just wander over a quiet Welsh training field on a summer afternoon. And yet, there it is, plain as day. Close enough now to pick out the individual bark of its engine. And it is not attacking. It is not diving. It is lining up to land. The pilot in that cockpit is relaxed. He's just come through a hard dogfight over the water and he's won. He's elated. He rolls the aircraft once over the field, a victory roll, a swaggering little celebration, and then he drops his wheels and settles onto the runway, smooth as anything. Home at last, safe among friends. There is just one problem. He is not in France. He is not on a Luftwaffe base. He has just landed the most wanted aircraft in Europe, right in the middle of a British airfield. And the men now walking out toward his cockpit are not his comrades. This is the story of the single luckiest afternoon of the entire air war. The story of a machine Britain would have traded almost anything to get its hands on, and the one man who gift-wrapped it and delivered it to their door. To understand why a group of RAF men nearly fell over at the sight of that plane, you have to go back. Back to the moment the sky over Europe stopped belonging to the Spitfire. For a while, in 1940, the Spitfire had been the hero of the free world, the little fighter that helped win the Battle of Britain. Beautiful, nimble, a match for anything the Germans could throw at it. Britain took enormous pride in it, and rightly so. But the war does not stand still. And in the autumn of 1941, something new appeared in the skies over France. At first, the RAF pilots didn't quite understand what they were seeing. A radial-engine fighter, blunt-nosed, stubby, fast, faster than they were. It could climb away from them. It could dive away from them. It could roll circles around them. When a Spitfire tried to turn and fight, this new machine simply used its speed, hit hard, and vanished before the Spitfire could bring its guns to bear. It was the Focke-Wulf 190, and it changed everything. Think about what that actually meant in a fight. Speed in the air is not a luxury. It is everything. Speed decides who gets to attack and who gets attacked. It decides who can run and who is trapped. And this new German fighter had it in abundance flying level, climbing and diving alike. It could pick a fight whenever it wanted and break off that fight whenever it wanted, and there was nothing the man in the Spitfire could do to make it stay. On top of that, it could snap from one turn into another far faster than a Spitfire could follow, flicking side to side like a boxer who is simply quicker than you. It hit hard. It hit from angles you couldn't guard. And then it was gone, climbing away into the sun before you'd finished flinching. The German pilots had a nickname for it. The Würger, the Shrike, the butcher bird, a small hunter that impales its prey. And that is exactly what it did to the RAF, because in 1941 and into 1942, Britain had gone on the attack. Rather than sit and wait, the RAF was pushing out over occupied France day after day, sweeping across the Channel, trying to draw the Luftwaffe up into a fight and bleed it dry. They called these operations by cheerful little code names. But there was nothing cheerful about what was happening up there. The new Focke-Wulf was tearing them apart. British fighters were crossing that gray water in the morning, and not all of them were coming back in the evening. Squadron after squadron ran into the butcher birds and paid the price. The Spitfire Mark V, the best fighter Britain had in large numbers, was simply outclassed, outrun, outgunned in the ways that mattered. A generation behind, almost overnight, and Britain was flying straight into it, every single day. This was no longer a war of sitting back and defending the home island. The RAF had decided to carry the fight across the water, to lean into occupied France, to force the Germans up into the air and grind them down. On paper, it was bold and aggressive. In practice, it meant British squadrons crossing that cold gray channel over and over into the hunting ground of the butcher birds. It meant the Germans waiting on their own side of the water, with the advantage of height and speed and home soil beneath them, free to choose their moment again and again. And the grind was relentless. Sweep after sweep, week after week. Young men who had celebrated simply surviving one mission, climbing back into the cockpit the next morning to do it all over again. The mathematics of it were merciless. If even a handful didn't come home from each operation, and you flew operation after operation after operation, then sooner or later the odds came for almost everyone. It was never really a question of whether the losses would hurt. It was a question of how long your luck could possibly hold. Picture what that meant for a young pilot. You climb into your Spitfire. You've trained for this. You trust your machine. And then, somewhere over France, you meet an enemy that is faster than you in every direction you can run. You can't outclimb him. You can't outdive him. If you turn to fight, he uses his speed and slashes past you, and he's gone before you can react. He chooses when to attack. He chooses when to leave. You are not the hunter anymore. You are the prey. The losses piled up. Good men, experienced men, disappearing into the channel week after week. And back home, the families waited by the door for letters that stopped coming. And here was the truly maddening part. The RAF knew they were being beaten by this machine, but they didn't really know the machine. They had never had one in their hands. They could see it in the sky, fast and deadly, but they couldn't take it apart. They didn't know its exact secrets. How fast could it truly go? Where were its weaknesses? At what heights did it lose its edge? How did the engine breathe? What was it really made of? Every wrecked Focke-Wulf that came down did so in flames, or over enemy territory, or smashed into the sea. Not one intact example had ever fallen into British hands. And you cannot defeat what you do not understand. This was the thing that gnawed at the men whose job it was to keep British pilots alive. The intelligence officers. The engineers. The test pilots, men who understood, better than anyone, that a fighter is really just a puzzle of numbers and limits, and that if you knew those numbers, you could find a way to beat almost anything that flew. They were desperate for those numbers. They pored over blurry gun camera film, over scraps of wreckage, over the hurried reports of frightened pilots, trying to rebuild the beast from shadows and fragments. But it was guesswork. Brilliant, educated guesswork, from some of the finest minds in the country, but guesswork all the same. And guesswork was getting men killed. Every so often, a rumor would ripple through them. One had come down almost whole. Maybe this time they'd finally have their prize. And every time, the hope curdled. It had burned up on impact. It had gone into the sea and sunk. It had come down in France, behind enemy lines, forever out of reach. The perfect, intact example they needed always seemed to slip through their fingers at the very last second. After a while, it started to feel less like bad luck and more like a curse. So Britain had a problem that was starting to look impossible. They were losing pilots faster than they could afford. Their best fighter was second best. And the one thing that might let them fight back, a real, whole, working example of the enemy's wonder weapon to study and learn from, was sitting on airfields in France. Guarded, unreachable. They needed that plane. They needed it badly. And there seemed to be no way on earth to get it, which is where this story takes a turn into something close to madness. Because if you cannot shoot one down intact, and you cannot buy one, and you cannot build one, there is only one option left. You steal one. Now that sounds like a line from a film, but this was a real conversation, held by serious men in the middle of a war they were losing in the air. The idea was as simple as it was insane. If the RAF could just get one Focke-Wulf 191, in flying condition everything might change. The engineers could pull it apart, the test pilots could fly it, push it, find the exact edges of its performance, and hand the fighting squadrons the precise knowledge they needed to survive. So a plan began to take shape. A plan so audacious it made hardened men swallow hard. The idea was to land a small raiding party on the coast of occupied France, right next to a German fighter airfield. Under cover of darkness, they would slip through the defenses. And among them would be one RAF test pilot, a man who knew how to fly almost anything, while the commandos held off the guards in the chaos. That pilot would climb into a parked, fueled Focke-Wulf 190, start it up cold, and simply fly it out, straight off the enemy's own runway, across the channel. Home, read that again. The plan was to sneak onto a live enemy airbase, in the dark, steal their newest secret fighter, and fly it away before anyone could stop you. The odds were terrible. Everyone knew it. The pilot would be climbing into an unfamiliar cockpit, every dial labeled in German, every switch in the wrong place, no manual, no time, and trying to get a strange, cold engine running while enemy soldiers closed in from all sides. If the engine flooded, if a fuel valve was in the wrong position, if the guards reacted a few seconds faster than expected, he was a dead man on a foreign runway, and the whole raiding party with him. And even if the engine caught, even if, by some miracle, it roared into life on the very first try, the stolen fighter still had to get up, get away, and cross an entire hostile sky bristling with guns and other German aircraft, flown by a man who had never once sat in that cockpit in his life. Every control in an unfamiliar place, every gauge reading in a foreign language and an unfamiliar layout, to be decoded at a glance, at speed, with anti-aircraft fire reaching up for him and his own heart trying to hammer its way out of his chest. Stop and think about what it says that this plan was even on the table. Nations do not gamble their finest men on schemes like this unless they are frightened, unless they have genuinely run out of sane options. The very existence of the plan was a confession, a quiet admission, at the highest levels, that the RAF simply could not solve the problem of the butcher bird by any ordinary means. They had been reduced to a scheme out of a boy's adventure comic, because the ordinary tools of war had failed them. That is how much power a single machine had come to hold over the entire air war. It was, by any sane measure, close to suicidal. It read like a fantasy. But that is how desperate Britain had become. That is how badly they needed to understand the butcher bird. They were willing to gamble men's lives on a plan that sounded like a boy's adventure story, because the alternative was to keep sending pilots out to die against an enemy they couldn't match. The volunteer pilot was ready. The plan was drawn up. The men were prepared to go and, very possibly, not come back. And then, fate did something so absurd, so wildly unlikely, that no scriptwriter would dare put it in a film. Fate delivered the plane for free. But before we get to that runway in Wales, you have to feel what that machine was doing to the men who had to face it. Because the numbers on a page don't capture it. The terror does. To be in RAF pilot over France in that stretch of the war was to live with a very particular kind of dread. It wasn't the clean, honest fear of a fair fight. It was worse than that. It was the knowledge that the fight wasn't fair at all. Imagine you're up there, thin, cold air, the drone of your own engine, and you know that somewhere above you, higher than you can comfortably climb, the butcher birds are waiting. They like the height. They like the sun behind them. They wait, and they watch, and they choose their moment, and when they come fast. There is often no warning at all. 1 second the sky is empty. The next, tracer is ripping past your canopy and a squad mate's aircraft is trailing fire and falling away, and a blunt-nosed shape is already flashing past and climbing back up out of reach before you've even finished turning your head. You can't chase it. It's faster than you. You can't dive away. It's faster than you going down too. Your training told you that if things got desperate, you could always turn tighter than the enemy and force him to overshoot. But these pilots didn't need to follow you into a turning fight. They didn't have to play your game. They had the speed to simply leave, climb, reposition, and come back down on you again whenever they liked. It broke something in men. Slowly, the confidence drained out of them. Because confidence in the air comes from believing your machine gives you a fighting chance. And that belief was being stripped away, mission by mission, funeral by funeral. The story spread through the messes and the crew rooms the way fear always spreads. Have you seen the new one? Nothing touches it. You can't outrun it, you can't outclimb it, you can't outdive it. Pilots came back shaken, describing an enemy that seemed to hold every card, and the men who hadn't flown yet listened and felt the dread settle into their own stomachs before they'd even left the ground. There is a particular loneliness to that kind of fear. You cannot see the thing that is going to kill you until it is already killing you. So you spend the whole flight with your neck twisting, your eyes raking the empty blue above and behind, checking, because you know the blow will come from up there, out of the glare of the sun, and you know that by the time you actually see it, for someone in your formation, it may already be too late. Hours of that. Every single mission. The strain of staring at a sky that looks empty and knowing in your bones that it is not. And what made those grim crew room stories so corrosive is that they were true. This wasn't panic inflating a threat. The pilots trading these tales weren't exaggerating to excuse their fear. The machine really was faster. It really did hold nearly every advantage. So the dread was not the flimsy kind that fades the moment you face a thing and realize it was never as bad as you imagined. It was the solid kind. The kind that gets confirmed, over and over, by the empty chairs at dinner. And fear like that does not stay up in the air. It follows a man down onto the ground, into the mess, into the silence, into the few short hours of sleep before the next dawn briefing. That is the psychological weight of being outclassed. It isn't just that more of your friends die. It's that you climb into your cockpit each day knowing the deck is stacked against you. And there is nothing your skill or your courage can do to change the raw physics of it. The enemy owned the sky, and everyone knew it, and knowing it was its own kind of poison. The Germans knew it too. Their confidence soared. Their pilots trusted the machine completely. They flew with the swagger of men who held the winning hand men who could roll in, strike, and be gone, safe in the certainty that the enemy simply could not catch them. That swagger, that absolute unshakable confidence is exactly what was about to cost them everything. Because on the 23rd of June 1942, one of those confident young German pilots climbed into his Focke-Wulf 190 and took off to do what his squadron did so well, hunt over the coast of southern England and cut down the RAF. His name was Armin Faber. And that afternoon, high over the water, he got into a swirling, brutal dogfight with British fighters. It was the kind of fight where the world narrows to a few seconds at a time, engine screaming, the horizon spinning, snatched glimpses of an enemy aircraft, the hammer of guns. And in that chaos, Faber came out on top. He shot down a British fighter and watched his opponent tumble away. He had won. And he was flying one of the finest fighters in the world. Why wouldn't he feel invincible? But somewhere in the violence and the adrenaline of that fight, something had gone quietly, catastrophically wrong. Faber had lost his bearings. Completely, in the whirl of combat, spinning through the sky, he had become turned around and he no longer truly knew which way was home. Now, this is where geography sets its trap. Faber, disoriented and exhausted and buzzing with the high of victory, looked down and saw a wide stretch of water beneath him and land beyond it. And his tired brain told him a simple, comforting story. That's the English Channel. Cross it, and I'm back over France. Back among friends. Almost home. But it was not the English Channel. He was flying north, not south. The water beneath him was the Bristol Channel, the stretch of sea between the southwest of England and Wales. He had it exactly backwards. Every mile he flew home was carrying him deeper into enemy country, not out of it. And he had no idea. None at all. He crossed that water, relaxed and confident, and saw an airfield laid out ahead of him. A friendly base. he thought. His base, more or less. Journey's end. He could already taste the debrief, the congratulations, the cigarette after a hard day's work. He was so sure of himself that he did something only a man completely at ease would do. As he approached the runway, he rolled his aircraft right over the field in a jaunty victory roll, a pilot's way of announcing to everyone below, "Look at me, I got one today." Then he lowered his wheels, lined up, and made a clean, easy landing on the runway at RAF Pembrey, in the middle of Wales, in the middle of Britain, surrounded on every side by his enemies. And the men on that airfield could not believe their eyes. For a moment, nobody quite moved. The most wanted aircraft in Europe, the machine their entire nation had been desperate to lay hands on, the plane men had literally volunteered to die stealing, had just rolled up and parked itself on a sleepy training field as calmly as a taxi arriving at a station. Then, instinct kicked in. The story goes that one of the men on duty, realizing what had just happened and that there wasn't a proper weapon within easy reach, grabbed the only thing on hand, a flare pistol, a signal gun, and ran out toward the cockpit. A flare pistol to capture the deadliest fighter in the German Air Force. And it worked, because the man in the cockpit had, by now, begun to understand. Picture that moment from inside the canopy. Faber slides it back, relaxed, expecting German voices, expecting the familiar faces of his ground crew. And instead, the uniforms are wrong. The words being shouted at him are English. The faces coming toward him are not his friends. The runway, the buildings, the flags, all of it, wrong. You can almost watch the truth hit him. The elation of the victory draining out of his face. The slow, sickening realization crawling up his spine. He hadn't flown home. He'd flown the enemy's most precious secret straight into their hands, done a little victory roll over their heads to announce it, and set it down gently on their doorstep with the fuel tanks intact and every rivet in place. There was nothing he could do. No way to take off again. No way to destroy the aircraft. He climbed out, and he was taken prisoner, and behind him sat the prize, whole and perfect. And somewhere out over the water that very same afternoon, the plan to steal one of these aircraft the raid men had been willing to die for quietly lost its entire reason to exist. Why risk a single life creeping onto an enemy airfield in the dark when one had just landed itself, fueled and undamaged, on a sleepy runway in Wales? The most dangerous mission that nobody would now have to fly had just been cancelled by the enemy himself. Britain had its Focke-Wulf 190, not a wreck, not a burned-out shell, not a handful of twisted parts dragged out of a crater. A complete, flying, fueled, undamaged example of the most feared fighter in the sky, handed over without a shot fired, without a single British life risked to get it. It was the kind of windfall that intelligence men dream about and almost never actually get. And this is where the wheel of the whole war gives a quiet, decisive turn. That aircraft was rushed away and handed over to the men who had been aching to study it. And now, at last, they could. They pulled it apart and photographed everything. They put British markings on it, and they flew it hard, wrung it out, pushed it to every limit, and wrote down exactly what it could and could not do. For the first time, British test pilots felt for themselves the thing their squadrons had been dying against. They took it up and chased down its edges. How it handled when pushed too far, how it behaved right at the ragged limit, how the engine breathed at different heights, and most precious of all, the exact point where its advantages began to fade. Every number they wrote down in those weeks was a number that had, until now, been paid for in the lives of men who'd had to learn it the hard way, in combat, and often did not survive the lesson. And all those questions that had cost so many lives were finally answered. Now they knew precisely how fast it was. Now they knew where it was strong and, crucially, where it was weak, the heights and the situations where it lost some of its magic. Now the men going up to fight it were no longer swinging at a shadow. They were briefed on a known enemy. They could be told, "Don't try this against it, it'll kill you, but do this, and you have a chance." Knowledge, in air combat, is life. And overnight, Britain had gained a mountain of it. More than that, Understanding this machine helped Britain rush forward its answer to it, an improved Spitfire, tuned and boosted to claw back the advantage, to meet the butcher bird on something like equal terms at last. The gap that had been bleeding the RAF began, at last, to close. The prey was learning to be the hunter again, and slowly the whole tone of the fighting began to change. British pilots went up in a fighter that could finally look the butcher bird in the eye, and they went up armed with briefings drawn from hard-tested knowledge rather than fearful rumor. The enemy that had once seemed to hold every card discovered that the cards had been read. The sky stopped being a place where the RAF simply gritted its teeth and endured, and started once again to be a place where it could fight back. And here is the bitter contrast, the part that should keep any commander awake at night. Think of what Britain had been prepared to do to get this. A raid so dangerous it was very nearly a suicide mission. Real men, ready to creep onto an enemy airfield in the dark and gamble everything their lives, quite possibly for nothing, just for a chance at this prize. That was the price Britain had been willing to pay in blood, and in the end, they didn't have to pay it at all, because the enemy's own overconfidence paid it for them. One pilot, one moment of swagger, one victory roll too many, one exhausted glance at the wrong stretch of water. That was all it took. Germany's greatest technical secret in the air, the machine that had humiliated the RAF for a year, was thrown away not by a British bomb or a British bullet, but by a single German pilot's careless certainty that he already knew where he was. That is the cruel arithmetic of arrogance. The butcher birds ruled the sky precisely because their pilots were so sure of themselves. That confidence made them deadly. But confidence and carelessness live very close together. And on that June afternoon, the same swagger that made the Focke-Wulf so terrifying in a fight is what led one of its pilots to hand it, gift-wrapped, to the very people trying to destroy it. The Germans had built a magnificent weapon, and then, through nothing more than one man's certainty, they gave its every secret to the enemy for free. They would spend the rest of the war paying for those 30 seconds over Wales. In the end, that is what makes this story linger. Not the machine. Machines come and go. It's the sheer, dizzying roll of chance in the fate of nations. A whole war effort, squadrons, factories, desperate secret plans, the lives of countless young men, and then the balance tips, not because of some grand strategy or heroic sacrifice, but because a single tired pilot mistook one gray stretch of sea for another. History turned on a wrong turn. There were factories full of people building fighters around the clock. There were commanders bent over maps deep into the night. There were secret schemes and brave volunteers and every last ounce of ingenuity a nation at war could summon. And in the end, the thing that finally cracked the problem open was none of it. It was one man, tired and triumphant and utterly certain of himself, looking down at the wrong gray water and thinking he was almost home. The machine itself would eventually be surpassed, as all machines are. But the lesson didn't age. The enemy's greatest strength, that total, swaggering confidence in the finest fighter in the sky, became, in one careless instant, the exact reason they lost their most guarded secret. Pride flew that plane home. Pride landed it on the wrong runway. So picture it one last time. That quiet field in Wales. The men on the ground shading their eyes, watching a blunt-nosed German fighter come snarling in from the sea. Watching it roll once over their heads in a cocky little celebration. Watching it settle onto their runway. Wheels down, engine ticking over, as calm as you please. And picture the man in that cockpit, grinning, victorious. Certain he was home as he slides back the canopy, and hears the wrong language, and sees the wrong faces, and feels the ground open up beneath everything he thought he knew. The RAF couldn't believe what had landed on their runway. Neither, in that terrible dawning moment, could he.